Welcome to Kingdoms in Conflict. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Wallace. With all the talk about following the science in the age of COVID-19, is it possible that science could be biased? Is there a bias against theism or intelligent design? And could this bias intentionally or unintentionally become the foundation for scientific racism or racism in general? The Bible says that we were created in God's image and likeness for the Creator's purpose. Evolution or Darwinism says creation is a random and purposeless process and that humans have a common ancestry with animals. We will discuss this and more with our guest, Dr. John West, the Discovery Institute's director, when we return. I want to welcome my special guest, Dr. John West. Good afternoon, John, and nice having you on the show.
Eric, great to be here. It was fun when we visited in person in Chicago a year or two ago, but it's great to be here virtually.
Yes, this age of COVID, we've got to do things a little bit differently these days.
Yeah.
But first of all, I want you to tell our guests, our viewers, a little bit about the Discovery Institute, not the Discovery Channel, but the Discovery Institute.
Yeah, rather different than the Discovery Channel. So Discovery Institute is a think tank based out of Seattle, and I'm vice president of it. We're probably most notorious for something called intelligent design, which is the idea that there's evidence in nature that we're the product of purpose, that we're not just some random and meaningless process, the product of a random and meaningless process, but that nature actually gives evidence of design and purpose. So this doesn't prove, say, that God exists, but what it does show is that science is not a foe of faith, and that in fact science goes along with faith, which actually goes back to the very origins of science, where the beginning leading scientists in the scientific revolution thought that there was evidence of design and purpose in nature, and that particularly my tradition, I'm a Christian, that actually goes along with science and is sort of pro-science, that Christianity is pro-science.
Well, hasn't the idea of design been somewhat had a hard time in actually getting a place next to Darwinism?
Yeah, well, certainly there are a lot of people who don't want it to have, but I would argue that science itself, by searching for both patterns in nature and trying to figure out how things work, that you can't help but find design. When you go down to a molecular machine inside our cells that literally look like machines and that have motors and that do things, that it just screams design. But you are right, there is a lot of ideology. Surveys of top scientists show that a lot of them are atheists or agnostics, and they don't want to see it. And so you have people like Richard Dawkins, former evolutionary professor at Oxford University, who writes about the God delusion. And so they try to hijack science on behalf of their atheist worldview. And so that does provide a lot of prejudice, if you will, in the scientific community from looking at the actual evidence. But the evidence increasingly is overwhelming. And even people say, there's a man named leading philosopher of science, Thomas Nagel, who's an atheist at New York University, but who has been persuaded that the evidence for Darwinian materialism isn't true. So he doesn't believe in God yet, but he's persuaded that this idea of this random and undirected process producing us all, the facts don't substantiate it. So, it's surprising the number of people who are actually being open to this. We published actually a book last year by a member of the National Academy of Sciences in Brazil, Marcos Eberlin. It's called Foresight, and it talks about how all these things in nature require foresight and planning. And it was endorsed by not one, not two, but 3 Nobel Prize-winning scientists. And not all those scientists are actually necessarily favorable towards intelligent design themselves, but they thought that the arguments were strong enough that they were willing to endorse this book that was explicitly pro-intelligent design.
You would think that as you read the text, at least for Christians anyway, it tells us that we can look at nature and that nature will tell us that God exists, right? And it's hard to understand how you cannot especially look at human beings and how we function and how blood runs through our veins, and that it had to be put by some intelligence, whether you want to call it God or what, but some kind of intelligence, something. Having said that, What does that say about those who come up with theistic evolution?
So theistic evolution means a lot of different things. And so I'd say that if you believe in a guided form of evolution, that God actually guided it to some purpose, then for myself, whether or not I think that's true, I think that that certainly can be squared with a robust belief in God. But unfortunately, much of what is gone after as theistic evolution today would be more appropriately described as theistic Darwinism. And it's the effort to try to say that, yes, things look random and undirected, just like Darwin said, but then somehow we try to square that with God. And I do think that's really a hard thing to do. I mean, if one believes that God really did direct things from eternity and knows all of us, and in Psalm 139 talks about how God knows us intimately before we're even born, knitted together in our mother's womb. If that is actually a true picture of God, then how do you square a scientific theory that says that we're the product of a random and undirected process, which was Darwin's key idea. Darwin's key idea was not just that we descended from, say, lower animal forms, or that we ultimately evolved from. It was that it was through a blind and purposeless process that only had immediate survival in view, and that somehow out of this interplay between chance and necessity, you and I got created. Well, okay. So I do think that, so why do some Christians gravitate toward that? Well, unfortunately, I think for a lot of them, it's peer pressure, cultural pressure is that we want to be perceived as good guys in the culture. And so I know, I used to be a college professor for 12 years. I had tenure. And I'll just tell you, in the academic community, there's a lot of pressure to conform and a lot of pressure to be liked. And so if you happen to be a Christian, in those communities, and in the scientific community, particularly biology, where many leading biologists are atheists or agnostics, there's a lot of pressure to find a way to reconcile Christian theism with unguided Darwinian evolution. So then you get tricks like saying, well, maybe God made things so they looked random and undirected, but secretly he did try to guide things. Or even worse, a lot of the theistic Darwinists argue that, well, because evolution is random and undirected, God himself doesn't really direct it and doesn't know how it's going to turn out. And that's a common trope that you find among academic theistic Darwinists, is that God himself can't really know the future because Darwinian evolution is blind and undirected. You don't know how it's going to turn out. You can't predict. And that includes God can't do it. And I'd say that's a pretty significant compromise with some foundational biblical beliefs.
That changes our theology a lot. When you start saying that God doesn't even know, the one who is all knowing. And matter of fact, if you look at the text, as far as I'm concerned, if you go throughout the Old Testament and New Testament, you see constant reminders that God is the one who created the universe. And if you kind of take that out, or say that creation is not what's the term you use, unguided, then we have real problems. Because when you get to the Gospel of John, I mean, it's clear that the writer of John is actually quoting Genesis, that Jesus was there in the beginning. Right.
And even more than that, I did some study on this, and you're a theologian, I'm not, so I'm just amateur on this. But in my reading of the early church fathers, there was a Gnostic known as Cerinthus who actually denied that God was the real creator, and that there was a second thing, a demiurge, that really wasn't ultimately controlled by God, that did it separately, and so that God wasn't really the creator. And John was actually writing to refute that by actually saying, well, no, everything was created by God through Christ. Well, what's the demiurge now? It's actually Darwinian evolution. The Christians who argue that God himself doesn't really direct, but he created this unguided process to do it for him, that he really isn't directing directly. That's nothing more than the Gnostic heresy of Cerinthus, that actually John's gospel was actually written according to Irenaeus to refute.
How do we get from Darwinism to the eugenics, the idea of eugenics?
Yeah,
and maybe you can explain what that means for those.
And a scientific racism, period. So, in Darwin's belief, the only way we are the way we are is because we were the product of this brutal process of survival of the fittest, that weeded out the so-called unfit. And so just think of this. So our creator ultimately in Darwin Darwin's sense, is not a benevolent God who created us from eternity and envisioned us as beings that could have fellowship in with him. We're accidents of this struggle for survival that weeded out all the bad things. And so in some ways, our creator in Darwin's view is mass death. What a negative, unlife affirming way to view. So, but if that's your view, and that's the only way we got the capabilities we currently have, well, in modern civilized society, we do all sorts of things to contradict survival of the fittest. And Darwin himself wrote about this in a book that many people haven't read called The Descent of Man, where he's just heartbroken, if you will, over that he says, we're inoculating people against smallpox. We're helping the sick. We're saving the poor. We're doing all these things that are helping people who nature would have killed off. We're helping them survive, and that this is going to destroy the human race. Now, Darwin, despite that view, was a kindly man, and so he was kind of revolted by his own view, and so he said, well, human sympathy won't allow us to follow this to its logical conclusion, is basically what he said. Well, but one question is, why not? If that's all nature is, if we're the product of this blind product, of struggle for existence, and that's all there is, well, why shouldn't we be concerned about it? And so eugenics was the recognition that, in a Darwinian sense, we're destroying the human race by allowing people to live and helping them to live through compassion that nature would have killed off. And so when you recognize that, you either have two choices. Either you go back to the law of the jungle, and you don't have social service programs, you don't have private charity, you go back to the law of jungle, or if that's too incompassionate, you reinstitute something like natural selection artificially through human reason. And that became eugenics, the self-direction, or the direction by humans of the future of human evolution. And so things like forced sterilization of minorities, of people presumed hereditarily defective in some way, people of actually lower economic classes often were targeted for sterilization, or actually in places like Germany, ultimately they were targeted for death and killing. I mean, they killed hundreds of thousands of handicapped people, and then of course they killed Jews using
Termination of the
techniques.
Jews. Right.
But
Right.
that argument in Germany actually came out of the Darwinian eugenics movement, and as one of its main levers. And so anyway, eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution by trying to, sterilize the unfit, the so-called unfit.
And your documentary, Human Zoos, actually deals with a lot of this, especially when you talk about scientific racism. So how is scientific racism, perpetuated through eugenics?
Yeah. So scientific racism, I do want to make clear, began before Darwin. In the 1700s and 1800s, there were scientists who really had a racist view of either that different races were created separately and unequal, or that there was one original human race, but then other races degraded. And so that view does predate Darwin in science. But as Harvard evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould points out, Darwin really gave a huge new impetus to scientific racism. And here's why. In the Darwinian view, you, I, anyone else, different human populations are acted on by natural selection differently based on the survival needs of your race or subspecies or whatever you want to call it. And so in a Darwinian view, you should actually expect different strains of humans living in different environmental niches around the world to be radically unequal. Because the only thing that makes them who they are is natural selection, the survival of the fittest, and that is based on their particular survival needs. So Darwin basically provided a research agenda for why scientists should think and expect radical differences between humans of different racial groups. And so he provided a research agenda that fed scientific racism for at least a century. So part of that you can see in these human zoos, which was putting non-whites from Africa, from Asia, from South America on public display as, I'd say, evolutionary missing links between humans and apes. And they did that They brought thousands of people from around the world to put on public display during the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, and I talk about this in the documentary. And then in 1906, they actually put an African man from Otabenga, from the Congo, in a cage with an orangutan, as again, here's a missing link between apes and humans. And they actually even put a sign on the cage as, he was a specimen. And, over 100,000 people visited that in New York. It's very interesting. And it was done in the name of Darwinian science.
And the interesting thing is in your documentary that I really love, because I do, at some point, I chastise the church for buying into a lot of Darwinian evolution, the eugenics piece. You're right, it does kind of give a scientific, and I put that in quotation marks, scientific reason to be racist, if you will. But it was the churches that actually stood up and said, this is wrong. We shouldn't have a human being in a cage next to an animal.
Yeah, thank you for raising that, because that is an inspiring story. And the churches have had a lot of racism, and I don't want to downplay that, and have not. But in this particular case in New York, it was not the New York Times that stood up. In fact, they justified it. I mean, the New York Times has never apologized for justifying what happened to Otabenga. It wasn't the Democratic mayor of New York, George McClellan Jr., who couldn't give a time of day to the ministers who were raising it. There was actually one white minister who was a Baptist minister who started to stand up, and then, of course, African-American clergy. And they made an argument explicitly that, human beings, all human beings, black and white, have souls created in the image of God. And so to treat any human being of any race like they were an animal is wrong. And they were poo-pooed by the intellectuals of their day, by the scientists of their day. I remember one article in the New York Times was poo-pooing the black ministers who raised this objection. Basically implying that they were anti-science, because we all know evolution is the same as 2 + 2 = 4. I forget what they said. It was just so condescending.
They were still using the anti-science piece. Huh? Anytime you don't like what people say, it's always anti-science.
Correct. And that was the argument the New York Times made to actually attack the Christian ministers, particularly African-American ministers. But again, there were some white ministers who also stood up for standing up for Otabenga and saying what was happening was wrong. And so, yes, a lot of Christians at the time, or at least with regard to the human zoos, did recognize that it was wrong. And also with regard to eugenics. You asked how that was tied in. And so if you think that certain races are higher or lower on the evolutionary scale, then who becomes a target for eugenics? Who's defined as someone defective? Well, in the South, it was if you were African American, or in some states it was if you were Native American. In California, it was if you were Mexican American. And it wasn't just, and I think I want to make this point, the Darwinian racism was also against some whites. So my great-grandparents, my grandparents came from Eastern Europe. Well, they were on the list too for eugenics, because if you weren't the Nordic supreme El Supremos. And so if you were whites of certain ethnic backgrounds, you were also lower on the evolutionary scale and subjected to targeting.
Well, that's, it goes back to, we look at our prime example of Adolf Hitler. I mean, he thought his particular Aryan race was superior to all others. As you look at scientific racism, how do you think, has it had any kind of effect on the racial turmoil that's going on right now?
Yeah, I think, well, it certainly has there is a fringe today called the alt-right, which I don't think is actually really on the right wing, and it's a fringe. And they have actually, unfortunately, tried to resurrect some of these Darwinian racist arguments. So that's on one side. I think on the liberal progressive side, you actually see what Planned Parenthood is doing to black babies and targeting black communities. Margaret Sanger was a leading eugenicist, and you have, I think, among white progressives, a lot of them actually, in their heart of hearts, actually think that blacks are less capable than whites, and they're getting that from their science. They won't always admit that, and but some of the patronizing way that they argue on things shows that they think that, well, blacks really can't live up to what other people are doing, which is all this is preposterous. But the way that they argue actually shows that they've imbibed some of this past century of very dehumanizing and false scientific claims.
It is so contrary to what the biblical text actually says. We're created in the image of God. And he doesn't say that he created white people one way and black people another way. He says human beings have been created in his image. Mm-hmm. And I think that the Darwinianism, I say that right, eugenics, all of these are very much anti-scripture. They're not biblically based at all. And I think the church needs to learn how to look at these secular ideas that want to come into our fold, and to reject them, wholeheartedly. And I want to thank you for your time. We've run out of time right now, and we need to have you back, because there's so much more I wanted to talk about with human zoos and so forth. If you haven't seen the movie, you need to see the documentary. There's also this thick tome out, this book that called Theistic Evolution is the name of it, right? Yes, it's excellent. And now I've got to go back and read through the scientific part. But thank you so much for being our guest, and thank you so much. We'll be right back.
Never before in America's history has there been a more desperate need for a unified voice to fight against the moral decay of our nation. Liberal progressives are pushing an agenda to destroy Judeo-Christian values, and mainstream media and other institutions are promoting the depravity of our nation. At Freedom's Journal Institute, we stand with those who are becoming marginalized simply because of their biblical faith and values. Like you, we are troubled by the racial and political unrest in our society. With the launch of our new online community, the Alliance of Freedom Fighters, we have risen to the challenge in the battle for life, liberty, and the pursuit of holiness. When you join our community, you will get access to FJI's digital libraries and information sharing portals, the ability to collaborate with other Alliance Freedom Fighters on both national and local community projects and issues, as well as needed support, encouragement, and best practices to champion our shared ideas and values. Go to allianceoffreedomfighters.com and become a part of the Alliance.
Welcome back. Many books, articles, and sermons have been written about creationism versus Darwinian evolution. As mentioned in a conversation with Dr. West, there have been attempts to conjoin the two, producing theistic evolution, thus taking what was posed by evolutionists as a random, purposeless, and unguided process, and now supposedly giving it purpose and direction. Unfortunately, this attempt to Christianize evolution flies in the face of a plethora of supporting texts that not only declare God the maker of heaven and earth, but that he did it in 6 days, not 6 billion years. The first chapter of Genesis, if you read it too fast or just as a matter of fact, you'll miss the beginning of a love story that has its origins here and runs throughout the biblical text. God's love for us will be missed if you aren't paying attention. The first verse says, Bereshith bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'eretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The second verse says that the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. The Hebrew words for the phrase without form and void are tohu vabohu. As I studied these verses over the years, it occurred to me that all the planets God created were tohu vabohu. This was the norm, not the exception. If you look at Mars, Venus, or Jupiter, or any of the planets, none of these planets were suitable for human life. This includes the earth. It is formless void until God transforms it. In other words, God designs a planet just for us. In 3 days, God will give the formlessness structure. He separates the light from darkness, he creates the vault, and then the dry land with the vegetation. Then he will fill the void with stuff. The sun, the moon, and the stars are the light sources. The birds and the fish are in the vault, the animals on the dry land, and then the apex of his creation, humans. You may ask, how does this prove God's love? Well, thanks for asking. In verse 26, what does God do? He makes humans in his own image, after his own likeness, and gives them authority. He tells them to be fruitful and to multiply, spreading God's likeness throughout the planet. This likeness is consistent in all human beings because we are one race, the human race. See Acts 17:26. Then in chapter 2, we get more detail about the sixth day and the creation of humans. In verse 7, God creates men out of the dust of the ground. Verse 8, he then plants a garden. In verse 9, trees spring up that are pleasant to the sight and good for food. And later in verse 15, God gives man a job, and no food stamps for Adam. He He is to work the garden and to guard it. He has only one prohibition: don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, after allowing Adam to name the animals, God fashions a helper in verse 21, fit for Adam. God creates human intimacy, love, and companionship. Thus, God creates a solar system, then makes one of those planets inhabitable for us with a garden. He creates animals and other creatures for us to rule over. He creates the first couple in his own image and likeness and commands them to have children to the extent that we subdue the earth. He gives us food to eat, a job to do. Man has his woman, woman has her man, and we later find out that God would visit mankind in the cool of the evening to have fellowship with him. It is love on a scale no one has ever seen before, because there is nothing humans have to offer the universe's creator except their loyalty and devotion in return. Unfortunately, humans will reject God's love for the promise of being like God by breaking the one prohibition: they eat the forbidden fruit. But this doesn't deter God's love or his demonstration of it. We don't have time to expound on this, but I will tell you that the good news is that the Son of God, God in human form, would invade the planet to rescue his beloved. The Gospel of John identifies Jesus as the true Son of God, God in the flesh, who was there in the beginning. He fashioned the world for us. And we are told in John 1:3 that all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And in verse 29, he has come to take away the sin of the world. To do that, he must spread his arms out wide and die on a cross for us, not because he sinned, but because we sinned. Again, the love story continues. But before Jesus is crucified, he promises to prepare a room for us in his Father's house, and promises in John 14:3, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, ye may be also. You see, God loves us so much that he wants to be in close fellowship with us. He prepares a room in his own house because we are part of the family of God. This was the case in the beginning of creation as God designed a planet for us. This will be the case at the end of modern history. As Revelation 21 describes the new heaven, earth, and Jerusalem, we are reminded again of God's love when John says in verse 3, and I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. This is not a new chapter of a love story, but the continuation of the love that only our God can demonstrate. He steadily pursues us, preparing a planet for us with a garden before we were created, preparing a room for us in the interim, and then preparing a new heaven and a new earth where he will dwell with us for all eternity. If it's all right with you, I'll stick with this version of creation. Until next time, God bless you.